Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead. Welcome to episode 170, Publication Gaps on Your CV. I haven't updated my CV in a while, and it occurred to me that it's been a while since I've put something new on there. And out of curiosity, I decided to open it up, really look at all the sections, and figure out when was the last time I actually put something on this CV. For the moment, or for the record, I'm in a full professor position. I've been working around 20 years in the academy. I have tenure. Luckily, I have all the promotions I can possibly get. Luckily, so I realize I'm in an extremely fortunate position, but that doesn't mean that I'm not vaguely aware that, ooh, there's some publication gaps in here. It's been a while since I put something on there. And especially because we do scholarly productivity, I thought it would be very helpful to kind of understand some of these gaps through the way that publications sort of ebb and flow through our CVs and so on. So for this episode, I am going to share a screenshot of my CV. It can be publicly available. It's on, I have a website called Christine Tulley. It's at WordPress. You can check it out if you want to look at it there. There's also some more description on our Defend, Publish, and Lead website. But the spot that I'm zoning in on for the discussion today, if you want to watch it on YouTube, you can. But I just want to walk through how I'm sort of thinking about what I've published, what I haven't published, and where did all that time go? Because where I'm looking at right now is specifically, when was the last time I published something? When was the last time I published something that was peer reviewed? And what was I doing in that gap in between? So that's what I want to focus on in this effort, in this episode, in an effort to really think through things like, what was the impact of the pandemic on my specific scholarship? Some people got more things out and published and in the world. Other people didn't. We've all heard about some of the pandemic slowdowns that were affecting parents that were homeschooling, essential workers, things like that. So if you were maybe a clinical faculty member in nursing, you probably weren't doing any scholarship if you were actually doing nursing during that time period. So I want to just kind of talk through some of these things in terms of how we understand it. Now, this episode is also with one bit of a caveat because certainly tenure track faculty, there is usually a hard deadline where you either meet the requirements for scholarship or you don't. I work with those faculty at my institution, and there's very little wiggle room around that kind of a deadline. So while I can afford to kind of take this leisurely look, I wasn't able to do that as a tenure track faculty member. I had to always think strategically, what's going to come out quickly, what's going to be the next thing, how am I going to fill this one gap in my CV. On the other side, though, we do work with institutions that are hiring academics, and sometimes they hire us to do presentations for new faculty as they get acclimated to their universities, and sometimes they ask us to look through, almost kind of make the call on the ability of somebody to put scholarship in. That's been a newer thing that we've been doing. And one of the ways that we do that is we just kind of look through how quickly people are able to produce things, but also, are they really engaged in their research? So my early part of my CV, I've got subject matter and topics and peer-reviewed articles all over the place, because my number one criteria as a tenure track faculty member was, can I get this out quickly? Is it peer reviewed? Does it count for tenure? Everything else to me was sort of off the table. So that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy doing those some of those projects, but there were definitely some that there's no way I would have done them, just because they really weren't in my wheelhouse. I wasn't that interested. There were other things I wanted to do. I know somewhere in this podcast I've talked about how I didn't get to do the dream project I wanted to do until around 2016, 2017, and then it resulted in a book I put out in 2018. But I had thought about that book. I had known about that book probably 2009, 2010, somewhere in there. So it's just to say that sometimes it takes a little while to get some of these things out there. So let me talk through how I'm looking at the CV in an understanding of, do I need to put my foot on the gas and get more things published? Or or am I able to kind of slow down? Am I putting a rhythm to the type of publication I'm putting out? Because while I don't need to produce multiple items per year, I don't want to let 4 years go by without putting something out. That's not great for a scholarly productivity research in general, and I wouldn't want to do that anyway. I haven't done that at any point in my career. So I wanted to make sure that I said something about how I think through this. So what is on screen right now for people that are audio looking? I'm just going through the different categories on my CV. So I had a book that was published in 2018. So now we are in 2024. So that was kind of put out, I believe, near the end of 2018. So, it's been a little while. I had one edited collection I did back in 2008. So you see right there, there's a 10-year gap between those two projects. The last time I put out a peer-reviewed article was in the fall of 2019. So that's something that it was in kind of my secondary research area. I teach a classical rhetoric class at my institution, and we have classical rhetoric built into our graduate program. But I do a lot of work with the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies and a group called Callion, an ancient leadership organization. They do a lot of really cool stuff. I'll drop a note to them in the show notes. But some of the research that was in that article coming out in 2019 was really about my secondary area. I consider my first area to be more in scholarly productivity and faculty writing. So, otherwise, just kind of doing a quick scroll through, I was putting out peer-reviewed articles, some of them, 3 times a year. Sometimes it would be longer than that. Some of the articles, I was lucky enough to have them get picked up in collections. So if I put it out as an article, maybe it would show up as a reprint in like the best essays of whatever year that was. That happened to me a couple of times. But last time I had put out a peer-reviewed article was 2019. So if you're keeping track, it's March of 2024. And so far, the last thing I did was in 2019, which is not totally true, but we'll see that in a second. I'm looking now in a book chapter section. Last time I did one of those for an edited collection was 2017. And I will say something about that in just a second. I made myself a little note so I don't forget to do that. Other than that, I have, though, put out something in the last year. And the last thing that I put out that was something published that's out there was an Inside Higher Ed piece that I did about research impact challenges, because I got really interested in how do you get faculty to care about doing things that will help increase the research impact. So for example, I've said on this podcast before the importance of getting an ORCID ID. I talked about how I had to really try to get faculty to do that at my own institution. And I also talked about the University of Michigan's Research Impact Challenge, which is a really cool thing. So I have written something and published it since 2023. And I'm not going to scroll through like conference presentations and stuff like that. I've also done some of those between 2019 when I published a peer-reviewed article and 2023. I have some of those. I did lose in there about 2 years, almost 2 years. I kind of timed this out. It was around 20 months of just time. I didn't write anything. I was homeschooling. I was doing all the things that many of us were doing. So I don't need to say a whole lot about that particular gap, other than even though I would argue some strong scholarly productivity habits, I like to write. I will always prefer to do that over prepping for teaching and some other things. So I should have had all the tools to kind of handle how I might have approached scholarly writing. And even I could not pull it off. I was homeschooling at the time, a third grader, then a fourth grader, kind of navigating a lot of things with that. And then also a daughter going to high school. So I had like an 8th grade, then a 9th grade during those 2 years. So I really didn't worry a whole lot about that gap because I knew everybody else was in the same bucket, and the people that were consistently cranking out work were probably not the norm. So I didn't worry about it. And also, as mentioned before, I didn't really have the worry about trying to get tenure or anything like that. So that was not an issue for me. However, one of the things that my gap in here, if we just look on straight up, when was the last time I put something in print? I technically have a gap from 2019 to 2023. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what was happening in there. I shouldn't say I have a total gap, because one other thing that's showing on screen, I have some more Inside Higher Ed pieces from 2021, 2020, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got like 5 of them between those two things. So I was putting out consistent something every year, but these are opinion pieces for Inside Higher Ed. They're not peer-reviewed scholarship. So if we talk about like straight up the last time I put out something that was technically peer reviewed, that would have been 2019. That's a long time ago. So what I want to do now is to talk about what I was doing during that time period and how that's going to show as a very fruitful kind of blossom of stuff on my CV. Most of us are aware of the scholarly pipelines. Some journals take longer than others. We might, really hustle, turn in 3 articles, and then nothing happens for 2 years, and then they all come out at once. I mean, ideally, we want them a little bit more spaced out, but that just has not been the case, and publication in general has not really been the same after the pandemic for lots of reasons. So what I was doing during that time period, and where I'm not overly concerned, because part of this conversation is like, when should I be concerned about having this gap, is because I was working on 2 different books that are both, well, one hopefully is going to be a go. I can't say too much about that one. But the other book was one that I was working on with some colleagues that was an edited collection. And so we had the idea, we worked on it pretty slowly in terms of collecting chapters for it and all that. That particular project is going to be a go, as far as I can tell. There's always things that could go wrong, but that one is going to be a go. When that one might come out in print, my estimate would probably be in 2025 that one would come out. The other one was one I was kind of working on during the pandemic and kind of fits and starts. Can't say too much about this here, but I will say that probably the first time that I worked on that collection, parted ways with the initial press I was going with. And then I needed to kind of think about, well, what press do I really want to have represent this particular project? So lots of things on that situation. I know I've counseled a couple of people about what happens when that happens to you. But in my case, I think it was probably for the best. And so I really looked to finding a publisher that was one that would align a little bit better with what I wanted to do with that project. And so that one I think is going to be a go. That one is going to be another project that'll come out probably 2025, 2026. Who knows? It's going to be a little while probably for that one. So these 2 big projects, I think, are going to show up sometime in the next year to 2 year period. So even though I've got this big gap, I've got these larger projects coming out. Some other things, though, that I am thinking of, because I always like to think about what's in your writing project mix. That's an episode that we've done on the podcast before. I will link to it in the show notes. But one of the things that this causes me to think about is a couple of different things. One, I have another book that I'm currently working on. So if everything goes according to plan with these projects, I'll have turned out 2 books in the next, 18 months to 2 years. And then I've got this other one that I'm really interested in writing. And I don't know if I prefer like the long form of a book. This particular one I've mentioned before in lots of other episodes, but this is one on all the stuff I do on the podcast. It's all in writing project management. Not necessarily all the things that are showcased here, but lots of stuff about that as part of the writing process. I've made the argument before that writing project management is part of the writing process. So I've made that argument in several places in my own scholarship, but this book is the spot to really talk about why that is the case and what we know about it. So that is a project I'm interested. But it also occurred to me that I really kind of have this gap in putting out some peer-reviewed articles. And, not everybody has to do those alongside books. I'm in the humanities. It is perfectly acceptable for me to just keep writing books and not bother with those articles anymore if I don't want to. But I will say that where my interests are as a scholar, some of that work is being done in the peer-reviewed journals. For example, one of the journals that was not on my radar 10 years ago, but now is very much on my radar is the Journal of Scholarly Publishing, because I'm really interested in the connections between how writers create work, what's the interaction with the editorial team, how basically scholarship gets produced and published. How does it go from an idea to a publication? And so, these interests are things that tell me that maybe I need to be thinking about peer-reviewed articles. So where this discussion is going today is that I encourage people to kind of take a look at their CVs. I mean, if you're tenure track, you're never far away from your CV, or if it's something that is required for a renewal of contract, if you're a non-tenured faculty, but you still have some scholarship requirements. Certainly, if you're in those positions, it's never far away if you're up to a promotion or something, or even on the job market. But if you have a little breathing room, like you're okay, you're in a stable position for right now. For me, I just like to think through the long game, which, that looking at your CV is a bit of a long game, because we know a lot of those publications that showed up on your CV, those were 3 to 5 years, maybe even longer than that in the making. And so for me, I know what I'd like to do, just kind of thinking through some scholarly priorities, is to continue to work on this book that I'm really interested in, the writing project management. That book is writing itself, and it's just been a joy to work on. So I would never stop writing it. That's where my thinking is at the moment. But it does have me thinking about what pieces from that project aren't really going to be served well in the book, but they would make really great articles. That's one place I'm looking. Another place that I'm looking is at just a couple of other ideas I've had. I've talked a little bit about storing ideas, and I probably need to do an episode on it again. But for the record, what I do, I initially used to store any old idea I had that was kind of a good thing for a presentation or an article. I used to store them on just a chart, a Microsoft Word chart that I made, where I just had them just kind of at the bottom of the chart as ideas. And if I saw a call for papers, I might look and say, did I already have an idea about that? But now they all live in my Asana project management board, and some of them are projects, but they're not actually a project. They're just the title of an idea, and then I know to go from there. So one thing I'm going to do now that I have this recognition is to look at those ideas and say, could I be working on an article at the same time as I'm working on this book? And so this is a question. I'm saying this because it kind of leads into something I think that'll be of interest. We have had multiple clients ask us to do something about juggling multiple writing projects and getting writing completed on multiple ones. Because sometimes, just out of necessity, you're writing on 2 or 3 projects at a time. And how do you go about doing that? So I'm pleased to announce that in May, we do have a workshop coming up on that very thing. So if you're interested, I will have a link to it in the show notes. You can check it out. But that's another way that you can check it out and see if this is something that you want to be writing more than one project. You need to be, because you've done your CV review. But if you finally, to close, if you haven't really looked at your CV in a while, it's a good idea to just see where those gaps are. I'm not particularly worried that I have this gap, of 2019 and then not really any peer-reviewed scholarship from that point, because most of those publications came out at the end of 2019. The pandemic hit in pretty early in 2020. So there's a grace period in there where I'm not super worried that there's going to be this, judgment that, oh, this person didn't produce anything in 2020, 2021, 2022. And you can see that I increased my writing in the other outlets in 2022 and 2023 when I'm doing stuff for Inside Higher Ed. So, I know the gap exists, but because I know it exists, now I feel a little more pressure to close that up and start working on a peer-reviewed article. So one of the things I'll make sure that I do in a podcast, because I have not recorded this before, but I'd really like to do something on a podcast, maybe a series of episodes about starting an article genuinely from scratch. I have an idea and nothing else. I'd really like to do something with that. So stay tuned, and happy writing this week.